Hello viewers, welcome to week 5, lecture 1 of Swayam course on 20th century literary criticism and theory part 1. I am Ashish Kumar Pathak, assistant professor, Department of English, Banaras Hindu University, and in this lecture I am going to talk about structuralism. Structuralism as a movement began in the 1960s or emerged, we can say, in the 1960s, and it is a culmination of various waves of formalism which had been existing in Russia, in Europe, or in America in different forms. For example, one wave is that of Russian formalists, in which we find the role of Roman Jakobson becomes very important. Jakobson was a member of the Russian formalist group, as we know. Uh, when the Soviet Revolution took place and the movement of formalism in Russia came to its end, so Jakobson moved to Czechoslovakia, where he founded the Prague Linguistic Circle, and then he became an important member of that, and all those principles of formalism were given a new shape and orientation in that school. After the Second World War, we find that in 1941, during the Second World War, in 1941, he moves to the USA, where he meets Claude Lévi-Strauss, and in this way they lay the foundation of structuralism. However, the ideas of structuralism basically, because it is linguistics oriented criticism, these ideas basically come from Ferdinand de Saussure's work, Course in General Linguistics, which was published in 1915. In addition to that, there were American anthropologists like Edward Sapir or B.L. Wolff. So from their work, we also find that a wave is coming. And in this way, structuralism can be seen as a culmination of various waves. Northrop Frye is another exponent of structuralist criticism from Anglo-American side. So in this way, we find that how it is an amalgamation of all those formalistic, anthropological, and linguistic waves, and how they culminate in structuralism. Structuralism, if we talk about the basic principles of structuralism, we find that structuralism is a movement in which critics are concerned with structures. They are looking at literature as a structure. They are looking at language as a structure of differences and analogies. And in this way, for structuralist thinkers, there is no role of the conscious author in making a literary work. In structuralism, we find that the notion of work is replaced by the notion of text. Work becomes text. So in a way, a sort of impersonal approach is very remarkable. A sort of objectivity is trying to be attained in criticism by these theorists. So the author as a conscious self is replaced by the structure of writing. So these structuralists believe that a work of art is not a product of the author, rather it is a product of various literary conventions, which are invested in language, and in this way it is an impersonal activity. The other thing that these structuralists, they are interested in various structures which go into the making of meaning. They are not very much interested in the nature of meaning. Rather, they are interested in various waves, methods, and conventions which go into the making of meaning. And primarily, we find that how these structuralists, they shift the focus on the reader as well. But reader, their conception of reader is not in consonance with the traditional conception of reader. Here we find that reader is also a sort of entity which is governed by various conventions of reading, right? So all these things are there. So we find that how in structuralism critics are concerned with structures or general laws by which these structures work. They believe that individual phenomena, they are mere instances of such laws, and in this way individual items have no meaning independently on their own. They have meaning only when they become a part of a structure. The other point that structuralists make, that meaning does not lies outside. Any structure of work does not refer to the external reality. So, meaning is lying within the structure. And in this way, we can find that how this literary structuralism flourished in the 1960s and it applies the methods and insights of the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, who is also considered the father of structural linguistics, right? So, structuralism is just like how set of laws and science, they are combined together. Signs are arranged according to certain laws, and in this way they are capable of creating a condition of meaning. That is what structuralists believe in. For example, Friedrich Jameson says that structuralism is an attempt to rethink everything through once again in terms of linguistics. And Roman Jakobson, Claude Lévi-Strauss, A.J. Greimas, Tejevan Todorov, Roland Barthes, they all can be considered as structuralists. Okay, so before we go into the analysis of structuralism in detail, let us have a look at the historical roots of structuralism. So, the Italian jurist Giambattista Vico, who wrote the New Science in 1725, he can be considered to be one of the forefathers of structuralism. In fact, the work New Science appeared in 1725 and it was not very much talked about at that time. However, it has a great significance so far as this movement, structuralism is concerned, or so far as this modern thinking is concerned. Vico was very much interested in developing the science of nations, what he calls, or science of man, right? So, he was interested in developing the physics of man or science of society or science of nation, as other thinkers had been like Galileo or Newton or Bacon. So, what is remarkable about Vico's thinking, that Vico believes that primitive men, they were not ignorant or barbaric as usually understood by people. They were people with poetic wisdom. Poetic wisdom, for that he uses the term sapienza poetica. Vico goes on to say that these people were, with their poetic wisdom, they responded to the natural world or environment around them in terms of metaphors and symbols and myths, right? So, they were capable of evolving these methods of communication with the world that they saw around them. Vico says that it is very difficult for the modern man to understand the mind of the primitive man, right? And if we look at the mind of the primitive man, the way they give an account of creation and foundation of social institutions, those responses should not be taken casually or lightly. In fact, they are serious responses towards nature, and they have a very substantial cognitive value as well, right? So, he says that their way of thinking cannot be dismissed as childish. Their ways of thinking were mature, very profound, and they knew the skill of encoding when it came to represent reality. So, myths, about myths, the way myths were developed by those primitive people, Vico says that civil histories of the first people who were everywhere naturally poets, right? So myths can be a replacement of human histories. He says that myths are capable of providing an alternative history of man, and this history was created by primitive man who were naturally poets, right? So what they find that what is remarkable about that, the way they discovered myths, the way they discovered fables, the way they discovered stories. So Vico goes on to say that they found the reality around them as a mass of chaotic and incoherent matter. So in a way, they tried to impose a kind of shape on them. And in this way, in their attempt to impose shape on this organized, unorganized or chaotic reality they found around them, poeticity lies in that, and in this way they deal with the shape of the world, and they try to impose a kind of shape on it, and this shape is taken as uh, given or true, and sometimes it is taken as natural. In fact, Vico wants to say that the kind of shape that they imposed on the matter, chaotic matter, in fact, it was not natural, but with the passage of time, the skill with which it was imposed, it was taken to be natural. He evolves the concept of verum factum. What he has made, what human beings, primitive men have made, they are called factum, and that is what they recognize as truth, that is called verum, right? So in this way, he says that these primitive men were basically poets. Like in Greek, culture, we find that poet is a maker. In this way, they were makers, right? And how man was capable of forming world of nations or human institutions. However, Vico says that we find that men are making those social institutions. Men are imposing, these primitive men are imposing shape on various things, and in turn, these men are also met by those institutions. So the relationship is that of reciprocity, right? So this making process, this process of making, is a continual recognition of recognizable and repeated forms. So two things we find, that recognition of a structure when a form has been imposed on utterly disorganized reality, and the other thing is repetition, that is important. Later on, when we talk about structuralism, we'll find that how these ideas, they recur in the views of either Levi-Strauss or Jakobson or Barth or other structuralists, right? So in this way, we find that Vico goes on to say that how the structuring of the world is done. He says that, in this structure, it has a permanent and definite human character. And the fact is that the structure is incessant. It is not that once a structure is made, then the work is done. No, this structure is an organic structure. It is incessantly growing all the time, right? So sometimes it is repetitive in nature, and sometimes you can find that predictable outcomes may be mentioned, right? So once these structures are made by these primitive men, which Vico calls world of nations, so he finds that there is a potent agency in that structure for its continuing structuring, right? How a structure continues to structure itself. I mean, how the structuring of structure is an ongoing phenomena. For example, once a structure is made about human society, so it takes into account, suppose, various rights, various customs, and what happens? Because those rights and customs, they are consolidated as a part of that structure. So after a considerable period of time, those things are taken as natural. And then we find that how man acquiesces to that, acquiesces to those structures of rights, customs, behavior, patterns of behavior, patterns of thinking. And once man acquiesces to that, it assumes a sort of natural form. We fail to realize that it is artful. It is also made by some human being. So in this way, we find that how Vico makes the first attempt to break this anesthetic impact of structure on human mind, right? He says that human beings and societies are not fashioned after models which pre-exist them, right? So he wants to say that there is no pre-existent given human essence or nature. So forms of humanity, they are always determined by social relationships and social institutions. And in this way, if we look at all these structures which are made by these primitive men, by their poetic wisdom, we find that all societies have more or less common language. That is what he calls mental language, which goes into the making of those myths, right? So he says that if you look at that mental setup, in which that metaphorical language is of great use, by which myths, fables, and other stories are created, which give a shape to humanity, human world, and human institutions. He says that if you look at those things, you'll find that there is a common mental language to different societies, right? So this is again a very important point. Later on, when we will be talking about Lange and Parole, where there is always an attempt to identify an objective general structure, which causes variations of various laws possible. So these ideas are going to be very fruitful for our discussion. The other thinker who is very influential, or whose views can be taken as the roots of structuralism, is Jean Piaget. His work Structuralism came out in 1968, and he tried to talk about structures in context of various disciplines such as mathematics, logic, biology, linguistics, philosophy, and social sciences. He says that if you look at structure, any structure has three features. First, wholeness. Second, transformation. Third, self-regulation. So any structure can be identified by these basic principles. So far as this idea of wholeness is concerned, by wholeness what he means, there is a kind of internal coherence among various entities. And he wants to say that these entities, they have no value, no meaning on their own, right? So independently they do not have any meaning. So they are a part of structure, and in this way these constituent units, they gain any kind of meaning when they are integrated to that structure. The other is, he says that constituent parts, they conform to certain intrinsic laws, and in this way they become the determining factor. So structure confers on items properties larger than those they possess outside the system. For example, these items, they may not be having that kind of value, that kind of meaning outside the structure, which they have when they are inside the structure. So in this way, structure is different from what we call an aggregate. In a structure, parts have no independent existence outside structure. In the same form they have within it. The other two features that Piaget says about structure is, structure is not static. The laws make a structure, they are growing laws. So in this way, the structuring is a continuous process. Structure is not a passive or redundant entity, but it is an active and transformational entity. So why? Because in this structure, constantly new material is being processed, and in this way it is constantly transforming itself. Piaget goes on to say that language is a basic human structure. It is capable of transforming various fundamental sentences into widest variety of new utterances while retaining these within its own particular structure, right? So that is what he says about the transformational nature of structure. Now, when we talk about how a structure is something that is self-regulating, So, by self-regulating, he wants to say that the structure does not refer to any outside reality or any outside element to validate itself. Its validation comes from the intrinsic laws of that structure, from the internal relationships of that structure, and in that way he gives the language, that how language does not form words according to the pattern of reality, but on the basis of its own internal self-sufficient rules. Piaget goes on to say, for example, in English language, if you use the word dog, dog does not refer to any creature crawling on four legs outside the world of language. So, external reality is not impinging on that word, on the nature of that word. Dog is something which is understandable only because of its internal relationship with other words, similar words, right, and or contrasting words. So, in this way, language is being looked at as a closed system in which everything is inside, right. So, the other thing, in this way we find that how the views of Vico and Piaget are very instrumental in giving shape to this movement called structuralism. Especially in 20th century, the rise of modern physics, we can say, especially the principle of relativity, in which we find that reality is not as it is observed by as any individual. So these structuralists believe that any individual cannot make an objective assessment or formation of reality. One is always biased. So, reality is something that lies between the observer and the observed. So, reality lies in this relationship, not in an individual's thinking. So, this relationship between the observer and the observed, it gives anything its semblance of reality. And in this way, they say that the entire reality, the wholeness of reality cannot be attained unless we look at this dimension of the perceiver and the perceived, or the observer and the observed. And in this way, when you look at literature, in literature, language is a structuring principle in which we find that various relationships determine the nature of language, and in this way, various anthropologists are also using the same idea, right, that how language is closest to the permanent structures that men have thought of, right. And the other thing, as I told you, that how the structuralism is a culmination of that movement formalism. So, that Prague Linguistic Circle, the group of scholars in former Czechoslovakia like Jakobson, Willem Nathusius, Lucien Tenzierne and Rein Welleck, how they all are very instrumental. So, they are talking about intersection of linguistics and literature, and all these thinkers are influenced by Saussure's study of language or semantic function of language, right. So, we know the development of these ideas, how because of the interventions of the Nazis and dogmatic Marxist, these movements were interrupted, right. And especially Czechoslovakia Academy of Sciences, in which two thinkers are important, Bohumil Tranka and Joseph Vacek. Their study of phonology and graphemics, that was very instrumental in giving foundation to this movement called structuralism. For example, Jakobson defines the phoneme as a set of those concurrent sound properties which are used in the given language to distinguish words of unlike meaning. So, phonology was very important development. So, phonology involves the study of speech sounds of a given language and their operation within the sound system of that language. It was again a very important precursor to, we can say, structuralism. Further, we find that how these new discoveries in the field of narratology and this relationship between linguistics and narratology, right, they were very important in giving shape to this movement called structuralism. So, if we look at structuralism, this binary opposition appears to be a very important concept. This contrastive relationship among various items, relationship of item to the whole structure, all these views are going to shape this movement called structuralism. So, for example, Welleck and Warren, he writes in his theory of literature that the work of art is considered as a whole system of signs or structure of signs, serving a specific aesthetic purpose. Right. So, in this way, we are going to look at a literary work as an assemblage of various signs, and in this way, Saussure's theory of signs was very important. So, in this way, I come to the end of this lecture, and in this lecture, I try to introduce you to the basics of structuralism and historical roots of structuralism, and how structuralism was a culmination of various waves which were existing during that time. And in the next lecture, I will be talking about Ferdinand de Saussure. Thank you.